Mike, thank you very much indeed for that kind introduction. It's nice to be speaking to an audience where I'm relatively popular. Certainly doesn't happen in the House of Commons very often. I'm here today to talk about the justice gender gap. Just recently there was an article in the Daily Express discussing the story developing in the Archers over the character Helen Titchener. The headline was, "We wanted to represent gender injustice. The Archer's editor defends Helen's imprisonment." Now, I'm not someone who has followed the Archers at all, but I do know that if they think they're doing a service representing gender injustice, then they've got it all wrong. Despite what the lovies at the BBC would have you believe, the very clear gender injustice is one that actually favours women over men, as I will go on to demonstrate today. I want to be very clear that I don't believe that there is actually an issue between men and women. I think the problem is being stirred up by those who could be described as militant feminists and the politically correct males who pander to this nonsense. It seems to me that this has led to an equality, but only when it suits agenda, that applies to women. The drive for women to have so-called equality on all the things that suit the politically correct agenda, but not on the things that don't, is of increasing concern to me. For example, we hear plenty about increasing the numbers of women on company boards and female representation in Parliament. However, there's a deafening silence when it comes to increasing the number of men who have custody of their children or who have careers as midwives. In fact, generally there seems to be a deafening silence on all the benefits women have compared to men. In this day and age, the feminist zealots really do want women to have their cake and eat it. They fight for their version of equality on all the things that suit women, but are very quick to point out that women need special protections and treatment on other things. One simple example to illustrate this point is the issue of prison uniforms. Men in prison on the basic regime have to wear a prison uniform. Women in prison do not. How, I have asked on several occasions, can this be fair? Where's the equality in that? I'll come on to the treatment of men and women in our justice system in detail, but this issue is about as clear as it can get. We have a completely different policy simply based on the sex of the prisoner. So what is the explanation? Well, I'm told that it's because women are different and they may have self-esteem issues which prevent the policy of prison uniform applying equally. Men and women are different. It's a fact. Yet this is not allowed to be a reason to prevent equality in the fields where men are differently better on the whole. For example, when it comes to jobs that require great strength. Oh no, that would be sexist. A woman must have equality and do whatever she wants, except not when it comes to wearing a prison uniform, apparently, obviously. When you think about it, in so many ways, considering men and women separately, as if they live in complete isolation to each other, is actually ridiculous. Neither group is isolated. Both sexes have mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, uncles and aunts, grandmothers and grandfathers, sons and daughters, husbands and wives, boyfriends and girlfriends. So for every woman there are related male parties and therefore a vested interest in men's issues. It is an unavoidable fact. So the justice gender gap should be of concern to all right-thinking people, men and women alike. I was always being told that women were being discriminated against when it came to our justice system. Yet all the anecdotal evidence suggested that this was wrong. I used to hear it in the House of Commons all the time. I used to hear that women were treated very badly in the criminal justice system. And I actually wanted to find out the facts because I thought that that was an outrage too, that they shouldn't be treated worse in the criminal justice system. And I, setting out to find the truth and getting the information from the House of Commons library, I've now amassed so much evidence to show that it's men who are being discriminated against that it's unbelievable that anyone could still be claiming otherwise. But they do. Just about 5% of the prison population at any one time in recent history has been female. The other 95% male. As of last Friday, the figures show that there were 3,856 women in prison and 81,272 men. Yet so much time, effort, concentration and browbeating has taken place over this tiny minority of women. There are countless groups and organisations calling for this number to be reduced. There are far too many politicians, male as well as female, willing to trot out politically correct nonsense on the subject, repeating facts that don't bear scrutiny. And there are far too many calls for something to be done about a problem that by anybody's standards is hard to see exists on the actual evidence. Let's just imagine for one moment that the male prison population represented just 5% of the total, and that 95% were women. Would there be an outcry on behalf of the 5% of men who were still in prison at the expense of the women? Of course not. There's absolutely no chance on earth that this will happen. So why is there all this concern over the female 5% of the prison population? Well, this seems to be because of the many myths being peddled on the subject, of the same misleading nature as some of the things in Vicky Price's book. You may recall Vicky Price, who was sent to prison after trying to use marital coercion, a defence which is only available to women, as a defence in court, and who then wrote a book called Prisonomics about her time in women's prisons. Her contribution to the debate on gender injustice has been lauded by some, but it's full of cherry-picked facts and is missing a large number of highly relevant details. In fact, the only link to economics in her book is that it appears to be economical with the facts to suit her particular agenda. Today I want to share with you some of the general myths on this subject and that I exposed in a debate I called in Parliament a few years ago, along with a variety of new facts and figures that have come to light since. The first myth is that I keep hearing, and still do, that women are very likely to be sent to prison and more likely than men to be given a custodial sentence. This is quite simply untrue. Everyone I've spoken to who is involved with the criminal justice system confirms anecdotally that this is not the case. But let's not take their word for it, let's just look at the facts. I asked the House of Commons Library to provide the evidence that more women were being sent to prison than men. Not only did they not provide this information, they confirmed that the opposite is in fact true. And the library said, and I quote, "The published statistics show that a higher proportion of men are given a sentence of immediate custody than women, irrespective of age of offender, juveniles, young adults or adult, and the type of court. For each offence group, a higher proportion of males are sentenced to custody than females." And I have the figures for West Yorkshire too, just to prove that this is happening everywhere. For example, robberies, which you could be forgiven for thinking are surely the same whether committed by a man or a woman. The imprisonment rate in West Yorkshire is 70% for men, but just 50% for women. Then, of course, those actually sent to prison, the average sentence for men was 39.2 months, and yet just 28.43 months for women. The Home Office also undertook statistical research some years ago to try to ascertain the best comparison for similar sentencing situations. The research looked at 13,000 cases and concluded that women shoplifters were less likely than comparable males to receive a prison sentence. Women first offenders were significantly less likely than equivalent men to receive a prison sentence for a drug offence. The Ministry of Justice confirmed that probation staff were more than twice as likely to recommend custody for male offenders due to be sentenced in Crown courts than for female offenders. 24% of males and just 11% of females. And even repeat offenders are more likely to fare better if they're women. 39% of men compared to 29% of women are sent to prison for committing more than 15 offences. All this shows that it's wrong to say that women are more likely to be sent to prison than men. The reality is the exact opposite. In addition to the undeniable evidence that women are less likely to be sent to prison than men, is the fact that, as I've mentioned in relation to West Yorkshire, their average sentence length is less than those given to men too across the board. Again, the Ministry of Justice said, going back to 2011, women given an immediate custodial sentence for indictable offences receive shorter average sentence lengths than men, 11.6 months compared to 17.7 months for males. This is not a minor difference. This figure shows that the average male prison sentence is over 50% more than the average female prison sentence for committing the same crimes. This is something that those who will allege to be so keen on equality should certainly be thinking about. Yet not only are women less likely to be sent to prison and likely to be sentenced to a lesser term than their male counterparts, they're also likely to serve less of the sentence they are given. And again, the Ministry of Justice itself says in its offender statistics, those discharged from determinate sentences had served 53% of their sentence in custody. On average, males served a greater proportion of their sentence in custody, 53%, compared to 48% for females in the quarter ending December 2011. This gender difference is consistent over time and partly reflects the higher proportion of females who are released on home detention curfew, which I'll come on to in a second. In the last few years that the figures have been published, women have had 50% more chance than men to be released from prison on home detention curfew. Some of the prison stories from Vicky Price's book also throw up some interesting facts. She says many women with children were released on something called Child Care Resettlement Licence, which I'd never heard of until I read Vicky Price's book, which allows them to go home and spend weekends with their children prior to their official release from prison. Given everything I've said about the likelihood or not of being sent to prison, then the length of sentence given, as well as the likelihood of early release, you might be forgiven for assuming that they would at least have the decency to serve what is left of their prison sentence in prison. But no, I can do no better than quote Vicky Price, who was herself shocked in her book, when she said, the result was that at times over the weekend, the prison was less than half full. In fact, what did amaze me was the sheer number of people who were away most of the time. Myth 2. Most women in prison are there for petty or non-violent offences and are serving short sentences. Many campaigns, you hear this all the time, say that too many women are in prison and that they shouldn't be there. They should be serving their sentences in the community instead because they've been sent to prison for minor offences. If we just take a snapshot of the female prison population at a moment in time, June 2014 is the figures I've got here. They're not, I haven't picked it for a particular reason. It literally is an average snapshot. Let's just look at the actual detail of these poor women who are serving their prison sentences, who should apparently be freed from the oppressive prison system. Which of these do you advocate, or do those who want to advocate reducing the female prison population actually want to let out? Do we want to let out the 260 women serving sentences for murder, the 103 in prison for manslaughter or attempted homicide, maybe the 354 convicted of wounding, the 131 for serious assaults or other violence against the person, or maybe the 54 for cruelty to children? Maybe it's the 92 for rape, gross indecency with children and other sexual offences. How about the 297 in prison for violent robbery, or the 215 in prison for burglary? Maybe the 294 drug dealers and importers. We could maybe let out the 53 arsonists, or the 29 serving time for kidnapping and blackmail. Or maybe it's the 163 in prison for serious frauds. Now, if we don't want to let any of them out, I'm afraid we're running out of options. We could, as many would no doubt like, let out the 525 who are in prison for theft and handling stolen goods. But if we did that, to be fair, we would have to let out the equivalent of over 4,000 men who are in prison for theft or handling stolen goods too, and in my opinion that would be ridiculous. Whilst the number of women sentenced to short sentences in any one year is one figure, this is often confused with the female prison population at any one time. And I want to decouple these two things as they're not the same and they need to be understood clearly. Looking again at the figures as an example, just under 16% of women are in prison for sentences of less than 6 months. This is very clearly a minority. If some do not class that as a short sentence, then a further 6% are in prison for between 6 months and a year. So 22% of female prisoners are in custody for up to 12 months, which covers all cases heard in magistrates' court and some in the Crown Courts. All the rest of women offenders are serving sentences of over 1 year, which means that their offences were so serious that they would have had to be dealt with at a Crown Court. This puts these women, 78% of the total female prison population, not serving short sentences for minor offences. They're serving longer sentences for the most serious crimes of all. Just for completeness, the figure of 78% of the female population serving over a year is 34% serving sentences of 1 to 4 years, 28% serving 4 years to life, 11% serving indeterminate sentences, and a further 5% of offenders are in prison as after being previously released, they either reoffended or breached their licence conditions. It might also be interesting to note that more women are punished for disciplinary offences whilst in prison per 100 of the prison population than men. 130 adjudications per 100 prisoners compared to 106 for men. And particularly interesting is perhaps that in some years there have been more female than male prisoners per 100 responsible for violent incidents whilst in prison. The third myth is that women are often remanded in custody and then do not get sentenced to custody, that they're wrongly sent to custody and not bailed. Again, I've heard the misuse of many statistics over the years, but this one is a pearler. The Ministry of Justice's own figures show that women are more likely to get bail than men. It's a fact. In 2009, 80% of women were bailed compared with 62% of males, and 20% were remanded in custody compared with 38% of men. These figures also back up, yet again, that more men than women are sentenced to custody. As it goes on to say, of those remanded in custody, 66% of females were then sentenced to immediate custody in comparison with 75% of males. The myth 4. I've also read and heard all kinds of things about how prison separates mothers from their children and how this unfairly punishes them. In fact, this is usually the main reason given for why women shouldn't be sent to prison at all. It's said that 17,000 children are separated from their mothers being sent to prison, and that 60% of women in custody have children under the age of 18. Leaving aside the issue of the childcare resettlement licence, which I mentioned earlier, it's not the system that separates any mother from their children, it's that individual's actions in committing crimes that have led them to be imprisoned to separate themselves from their children. But what about all these women who are allegedly being so unfairly dragged away from their poor children by overly harsh magistrates and judges? Again, another big myth. A senior civil servant at the Ministry of Justice very helpfully confirmed that 2/3 of the mothers sent to prison who have children were not even looking after them at the time. They'd had the children taken away from them at the time. She apparently said of the women being sent to prison, 2/3 of them didn't have their kids living with them when they were sent into prison. So why on earth is there all this outcry about separating mothers from their children when most of the mothers in prison were not being mothers to their children anyway? When it comes to the minority who do actually look after their children, it would also not be right to assume that they were all fantastic mothers. Many will be persistent offenders with chaotic lifestyles. Some will end up dragging their children into their criminal lifestyles, and some will scar their children for life along the way. Others will have committed very serious offenders. Sarah Salmon from the Action for Prisoners' Families said, for some families, the mother going into prison is a relief because she has been causing merry hell. Something that has also caused me great concern is the fact that women involved in offences, involving cruelty to children or the neglect of children, have been able to avoid prison in some cases using the fact that they have primary caring responsibilities for their children as an excuse. How on earth can that possibly be right? More women than men benefit from this get-out-of-jail-free card, and yet more women are convicted of offences against children. In fact, 40% more in the latest year. Yet, you've guessed it, they are less likely to be sent to prison for exactly the same offence. I wouldn't have thought you needed to be Einstein to work out that if the offence involved the children being abused or mistreated, that should be even more of a reason to be separated from those children and not an excuse to stay with them to avoid prison. The custody rate for child cruelty or neglect is in fact 33% for men and just 15% for women. The Sentencing Guidelines Council are currently drawing up a new guideline on this, And I raised this bizarre state of affairs with the chairman, Lord Justice Tracy, back in March at our select committee. It seemed to me to be such an obvious point, and to be fair, he did agree that it was very valid. So I sincerely hope this is one thing we can at least see the back of in the future. Back to the point about mothers in prison generally. If we're so concerned about the children of women offenders, what about the estimated 180,000 children who are separated from their fathers because they are in prison? In this age of equality, what about this much higher figure? Should we not be more at least equally outraged about this? And if not, I'm sure we'd all like to know why not. Myth 5. Women are treated more harshly in the justice system than men generally. It's quite clear that women are less likely to be sent to prison than men. So we need to look at other court disposals to see if they're treated more harshly than men in other areas. If they're not being sent to prison as frequently as men, then they're presumably being sentenced at the next level down to a community order. But actually they're not. According to the Ministry of Justice figures, yet again, men are more likely to receive a community order than women. 10% of women sentenced are given a community order compared to 16% of men. And the Ministry of Justice say that these patterns were broadly consistent in each of the last 5 years. So women are less likely to go to prison, less likely to be given the next step down, which is a community order. But that's not all. Of those who are given a community order, the ones given to men are likely to be much harsher. The Ministry of Justice said the average length of all community sentences for men was longer than for women. And for women receiving a community order, the largest proportion had 1 requirement, whereas the largest proportion for men had 2 requirements. Given the more severe sentences for men at the higher end of the sentencing spectrum, it's unsurprising, therefore, that women were more likely to receive the low levels of punishment at courts. It's a fact that a higher proportion of female defendants receive fines than males. All this shows that throughout the court sentencing regime, men are on average treated more severely than women. Other ways I want to touch on that men lose out include in the family courts, being the victim of violence, and when it comes to the treatment of male and female paedophiles. Family courts. It's quite clear that the courts are more likely to place children with the mother over the father. This is certainly a massive area where men face very different treatment to women. I really do think people underestimate the effect on fathers of having to battle to see their children and facing the inevitable likelihood that they will come off worse simply because of their sex. I'm certainly not saying that all cases are like this. Reasonable mothers will surely allow the father as much access to his children as possible if she had custody and they were not a threat to them. But life isn't always as simple as that. Many women use their children as a stick to beat the father with, either because they are bitter about the failed relationship, for financial reasons, or because they've moved on and it's easier for them if their new partner takes on the role of father to their children. Victims of violence. In Parliament, we always seem to be hearing about strategies for combating violence against women and girls. In fact, there have been specific debates in Parliament on this very subject. You could be forgiven for thinking that there is a special problem in relation to violence against women and girls, which does not apply to men and boys. Some might think that there must be far more women and girls who are the victims of violence than men and boys as a result. However, the reality does not match the concerns people seem to have. It is a fact that in this country, men are much more likely to be victims of violent crime than women. The Ministry of Justice's most recent biennial statistics on the representation of females and males in the criminal justice system confirmed that 1.4% of women interviewed in the crime survey for England and Wales reported being a victim of a violent crime, compared to 2.3% of men. And it's not just when considering violence generally where men do worse than women. Women accounted for only 30% of all recorded homicide victims between 2006 and 2013, whilst men were victims in the remaining 70% of cases. The picture here is that men and boys are by far the more likely victims of violence and murders than women and girls. And yet there is little or no mention of them in the debates we've had and the strategies that have been drawn up in relation to females. So I asked the following question to the Secretary of State for Education in Parliament: what her policy is on educating children about violence against men and boys. I also asked what her policy is on educating boys about domestic violence against men and boys. The reply from the Minister, Nick Gibb, was, Education has an important role to play in encouraging young people to build healthy relationships and to identify those relationships which are unhealthy. Pupils may be taught about violence against men and boys in personal, social, health and economic education. So I'll leave that there for you to consider. Without veering into the realms of the whole domestic violence debate, as that's almost a whole separate issue, and we've been hearing about that already this morning. One thing that is worth noting when it comes to sentencing is that despite all the evidence that shows women as the perpetrators of domestic violence in far more cases than some would like us to think, the community requirement that is imposed by courts on those who commit an offence in a domestic setting can only be imposed on men and does not deal with female offenders. As usual, this shows that the whole issue of equality only works one way. One additional interesting fact I discovered is that there are 3,750 male prisoners who were victims of domestic violence compared to 1,323 female prisoners who were victims of domestic violence. Male and female paedophiles. There's been the rise of publicity surrounding female paedophiles. There have been some high-profile cases recently where the sentences given to the women were much more lenient than those which would have been given if they were men. I have personally appealed against some of them for being unduly lenient with the Attorney General, and they have actually been overturned and resulted in the female offender being given an immediate custodial sentence when originally one had not been given by the court. It's clear that many sentences are lenient, but as some of you will know, if they are considered unduly lenient, they can be overturned. I would urge every single one of you to consider this as an idea for action, as anyone can write to the Attorney General to say that a sentence has been unduly lenient. Unfortunately, only the most serious of offences are covered by the scheme, and there are some anomalies in the system even then. And you also have to make sure that the request to review the sentence is received within 28 days. The scheme may well be extended in the future. That's certainly the plan of the government at the moment, and it's one way in which you can play a key role in ensuring that we try and get real equality when it comes to sentencing by the courts. I believe that these facts and figures show that there are certainly questions to be answered in relation to the treatment of men and women in the justice system. It seems that there is clear discrimination against men, and certainly not the other way around. So if outcomes are all important, then what do people say about this? What's going to be done to deal with this bias? Well, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Women, Equalities and Family Justice has made an announcement. She has said that she wants to see fewer women in prison. Not fewer people, not fewer men. You heard me right, fewer women. In fact, in the Conservative manifesto, it said, "We will improve the treatment of women offenders, exploring how new technology may enable more women with young children to serve their sentence in the community." Now, I'm not someone who's going to be supporting prisoners, but where on earth is the equality in that? How on earth does that fit with the Equality Act? It's just like the example I gave of female prisoners not having to wear a uniform. Somehow the fact that hardly any women are in prison is a problem just because it is. It just is because they're women. If there is to be true equality, which apparently is what people want, this cannot be allowed to continue. We should be gender blind when it comes to sentencing people and sentence them for the crime that they've committed. I even wrote to the Equality and Human Rights Commission to see if they could be tempted into saying that the government's policy intentions were clearly discriminatory, as they obviously are. But alas, no joy there so far yet either. If women, even those who are mothers, commit crimes serious enough to warrant prison sentences, then they should go to prison. We need to stop pussyfooting around when it comes to female offenders. I only wish there were more examples of cases like this one, where a judge in my local Crown Court in Bradford recently said to a female offender, "I have every sympathy for your children, but the biggest burden they labour under is that their mother is a drunken thug," before rightly sending her to prison. As I hope I've shown, the reality of the treatment of women in our justice system is very, very different to the picture some would like to paint. And as long as these misconceptions are perpetuated, I will do my best in Parliament to expose them for the myths that they really are. Thank you.
Oh, yes. My local MP is Penny Morden, Portsmouth North, and she's said she would help us in whatever way she could with men's causes. Have you got any other allies in Parliament?
Well, Penny's a great MP, so you're very well represented in Parliament by her. Yes, there are some, but we are very, very small in number, and we get drowned out, I'm afraid. And we get derided every time we try and raise any of these points in the chamber. I mean, the House of Commons is really one of the worst arenas for bullying that you will ever find, to be perfectly honest. It's the tyranny of the politically correct majority in there, and they hate anybody who tries to put a different perspective. But there are some. There are not many. There are probably more who believe what I say than will actually admit that believe what I say, but there are very few who will actually stand up and say it, because you do get derided for saying it.
Yes. Thank you, Philip, for a really interesting talk, an entertaining talk. And I've read your work before. Could you answer the two questions, please? The first one is, do you think there's a favouritism towards women, discrimination in favour of women, or discrimination against men in this system? You've shown the bias. Now, which way do you think it might lie? And whichever way you think it might lie, what do you think is the primary cause of this bias? Is it political, gender political, or what you may think is something other?
Well, the bias is definitely about it's about being lenient to women. It's not about being harsh to men. In fact, if you want my honest opinion, I think too few men are sent to prison as well. To be perfectly honest, I want to see more criminals sent to prison. To be perfectly honest, it's very hard to be sent to prison in this country. So I'd like to see more people in prison. Full stop. But it's definitely women who are treated favourably. The reason why, there's all sorts of reasons why. I think that there's been this myth that's built up about that women are treated more harshly by the criminal justice system, and it's the old thing: if you keep repeating a lie often enough, people will believe it. And it goes. I believed it to start with. I heard it so often in Parliament, I thought it must be true, which is why I started to look into it, because I was so appalled by the idea. So I think partly it's because people just don't know the facts. I actually think there's a certain amount of male chauvinism in it as well, actually, that think that, prison isn't a place that women should go to. Actually, ironically, I think there is an element of that in Parliament, that prison isn't a place for women. And I've certainly heard that mentioned by a few people in the past too. But there also is a rather aggressive women's rights agenda in Parliament too, and not just by women, I might add, by lots of male MPs as well. So it's a combination of all of those things. All I can try and do is to keep chipping away, pointing out the facts. I mean, all the information I give here is they're not my figures. They're not things that I've brought up. These are all the government's own figures. And I try and point out to the government that actually they pass laws which fly in the face of their own figures, which is bizarre. But I think there's all sorts of reasons. And also, it's like I say, it's also about the tyranny of the majority. In Parliament, it's very easy just to go along with the accepted wisdom and be part of that kind of agenda. It's the easiest thing in the world to do. It's very difficult to stand up and actually say something different to the accepted wisdom. I know we're supposed to believe in free speech, but I'm afraid there's still lots of opinions in Parliament you're not allowed to hold, which is very sad, really.
In the light of the Tory recent leadership elections, who do you think is more likely to endorse and to ratify the Istanbul Convention between Theresa May and Andrea Leadsom?
Well, I'm not sure I can answer that question, because I don't think I've ever had that discussion with either of them. But for what it's worth, which is not a great deal, in both ballots on earlier this week, I voted for Andrea Leadsom, and I'll be voting for her again in the third ballot for the party members.
Can I thank you for an excellent speech, and also thank you for your bravery in speaking out on these issues in Parliament, because it's not politically correct, even though it is correct, it's not politically correct. I just really wanted to ask you how hopeful or unhopeful you are about whether things can change in future, whether the actual facts that you've presented to us at this conference will become mainstream knowledge, or are you constantly fighting a losing battle?
Well, I constantly fight many losing battles in Parliament, to be honest. But look, if I didn't think we could win these, I wouldn't bother hanging around in Parliament. I've got better things to do with my time than hang around just losing all the time. And the thing that gives me hope is that in 2005, I was the only MP in Parliament, literally the only one, who would stand up and say the words that we should leave the European Union. And I was derided in exactly the same way then, to be perfectly honest. And yet, that's now been achieved. And so if we could achieve that when I was the only voice saying that in 2005, I've got to be hopeful that actually common sense will prevail over this issue as well. And if I didn't think I could make a difference, I wouldn't hang around. So, no, in Parliament, you've got to keep going. Even when it's unpopular, you've got to keep going. To change things is never easy. But the only way you change things is by rolling your sleeves up and getting stuck in and trying to do something about it.
Hi, I'm Anil Kumar from Bangalore, India. So we work for men's human rights issues in India. And since last 10 years, our experience is that countries like India face a lot of international pressure, often say from United Kingdom or European Union in feminist and gender issues. And because these countries are of different cultures and they are very far off, one doesn't really get a real perspective, and often people may not care. So the end result is that to show itself as a good government, the government in India ends up creating all kinds of crazy laws, and which lead to gross human rights violations. For example, not marrying your girlfriend can mean rape in India right now. And a lot of courts in India have openly talked about this, but that is how the laws are made. And the laws are totally crazy and unbelievable. That's what is going on, and the magnitude is huge. Our parliament discusses about misuse of rape and domestic violence laws more than any other parliament in the world. However, there is a complete disconnect when it comes to the international governments and the politicians and the lobby groups which operate from, say, here in United Kingdom or European Union. So I would like to ask you, do you see that this is an issue, and do you see there is a potential that this can change over the next 3 to 4 years?
Well, you're very welcome from India. We'll be hoping to do a trade deal with India now we're freed from the shackles of the European Union. So I hope we can be nice to have a deal with a growing part of the world's economy rather than a declining one. Look, I don't really know. I mean, I don't know what happens in India. I've got my hands full with what goes on in the UK, to be perfectly honest. But I do think really that I'm not a big fan of us as a country and other countries trying to impose our values on other countries. I wouldn't really appreciate other countries trying to impose their values on us, and so I'm always reluctant to go down that line. And so. You know, really, it's a matter for India what it wants to do in terms of its laws. It's not for me to interfere in that. But I think what we should do as a country here is get our own house in order at dealing with real equality, rather than going around lecturing everybody else when we're so bad at it ourselves here. But I wish you well for the future.
Thank you.
I'm afraid we're going to have to make this the last question to keep on track on the timetable.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm going to take up the last question. One situation, I've just come back from Australia and just finished electing or trying to elect a government in Australia. We're still counting. We don't know who's going to win and who's not. But what I did notice, and for those of you who don't follow Australian politics, the development of the importance of the micro-parties in Australia. We have a lot of micro-parties who have done very well in recent elections. Partly it's our election system, but what I have noticed is two in particular members of the lower house have put forward protocols or policies that favour men's issues. And now, this may be just a desperate, grab for a few extra votes, but it all helps. And I wonder whether there's any sense that in Britain and in other countries we're seeing a growth of the minor parties because the major ones I felt like they don't represent the electorate adequately.
Yes, well, I may not make myself too popular with this one. Look, yes, I mean obviously there's been the rise of UKIP in particular in the UK, and that's largely because the public felt that the major parties. And increasingly the Labour Party, actually. I think most people, when it started, UKIP was taking more votes off the Conservatives, but actually in recent years it's been the other way round. It's been taking more votes off Labour because I think lots of working class people felt that the Labour Party wouldn't recognise a working class person if they tripped over one. And so that's what's happening there. I think I don't want to get into a technical debate about voting systems, but in this country, it's very difficult for a minor party to break through because of our first past the post system. In effect, in other countries, lots of other countries, you have lots of parties standing, and then after the election, you try and cobble together a coalition, as will no doubt be happening in Australia, to try and form a government. In the UK, we do exactly the same thing. We just do it the other way round. We put our coalitions together before the election, and one's called Conservative, and one's called Labour. They're the main sort of coalition parties, but they are within them coalitions. We have people with a range of views within those parties. I used to sit directly behind John Bercow when he was sat on the Conservative benches before he was the Speaker, and we used to discuss lots of things. And he's a great friend of mine. I'm a big fan of John Bercow, and I get on really well with him. We used to discuss about lots of issues together, and I think we only found ever one thing on which we agreed. Even though we were both sat on the Conservative benches and we both voted together about 95% of the time in the voting lobbies. So we just put our coalitions together before the election, really, and call them Conservative. And my advice to anybody, which is where I may make myself very unpopular, particularly with Mike at this point, my advice to anybody who wants to influence things is I always say I think the best way of doing it is to get involved with the major parties and try and help them bring about through them the agenda that you want to see, the party that you feel most comfortable with, because in reality that is a much more quicker way, I think, of getting to where you want to than trying to start a new party and getting it elected. And when people always said to me that I should join UKIP because I wanted to leave the EU, I always said to them, and I'd like to think I've been proved right on this, I always said that there would be a Conservative government that would take us out of the EU long before there was ever a UKIP government elected in Parliament. And I think the same thing applies to virtually every issue. I personally just put it, but everyone has to do what they think is right for them. But my personal view is that it's best to get the big parties to adopt the agenda and try and influence those big parties to move on these things. And that's what I seek to do. Whether I fail or succeed is a different matter. Well, that's certainly what I'm trying to do.
Philip, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Philip Davies MP.
Really enjoyed that. Thanks so much for coming along.